I've been traveling a lot and speaking a lot to different kinds of people, and most recently in Europe, where it was a tremendous kind of bridge building thing to get everything rhetorically lined up and squared around to where I could even introduce the subject of psychedelics. So I see that I've returned to the home congregation here. And because, this seems to be the overwhelming focus of this group, which is interesting. It's even sometimes sort of confining to me because I would wander maybe in other directions, but every prophet is the captive of his earliest ideological expression. Lenin couldn't do much about Leninism once it had passed a certain point. So, in hearing what people's interests were and trying to think about it in new ways, the uniting thing in the 20th century, I think one of the things that sets the 20th century completely apart, really, from previous times, if not ontologically, then by degree, is the focus on the moving image and the role that this has had in shaping 20th century culture. And it comes really in three forms. It comes in the natural and available form of the dream, which always, to some degree, has shaped human culture. But for Freud and Jung in the early 20th century and their followers, the dream took on a whole new significance that it had never had before. It was seen as a cryptic messenger from a hidden world. And as these things seem to work out, concomitantly, a technology of the moving image was developing, which was film. And film and the dream then become almost the two defining poles of the evolution of the aesthetic of the 20th century over the first half of it, we'll say. And then in 1953, because that's when Gordon and Valentina Wasson discovered the mushroom, or earlier, if you want to date it to Hoffman's discoveries in Switzerland, or the German work in the 20s, or later, if you want to date it to the discovery in 56 of DMT by Zara. But at any rate, at some point, the third triad is introduced, which is the hallucinogenic or psychedelic experience. And all three of these areas of concern have adumbrations in the primitive, the stress on dreaming, even the magic lantern and prestidigitation feats of Renaissance magic have a relationship to early film. And of course, the psychedelic experience is absolutely archaic. Nevertheless, the coming together of these three concerns in this particular fashion in the 20th century set the stage, I think, for an important part of what I will call during this weekend the archaic revival. And the archaic revival is nothing less than a strategy for cultural survival on a global scale. And it's a strategy that is taking place in the animal body of mankind. It's not an intellectual strategy or a rational strategy. This is what happens whenever a society is slammed to the wall. It unconsciously reaches back through its history or its mythology for a steadying metaphor. Now, the last time this happened in the West and worked was at the time of the collapse of the medieval Christian eschatology, at the time of the rise of urbanization and banking and secular society, the model of the Christian universe was no longer serviceable. And very suddenly, philosophers, politicians, social planners reached into the past for classic models. And this was in the 15th and 16th century. And they created classicism, the revivification of Roman law, Greek architecture, Greek polity. All of this happened 1,000 to 1,500 years after these things had been completely abandoned. But then they became the basis for modern secular civilization, and our laws are Greco-Roman, and our architecture and our aesthetic and so forth and so on. Well, the way this is happening in the 20th century is, number one, at a much more deep and profound level, because it's a global reflex. The entirety of modern civilization has shot its wad in some sense. You know, from the perspective of 500 years, a society that cannot put bread on its grocery shelves, such as the Soviet Union, and a society such as our own that is $3 trillion in debt, the difference is negligible. I mean, both of these societies are functionally bankrupt. So we're living through, and have been living through throughout the 20th century, an experience of the dissolution of boundary and form. Everything has been in a state of flux throughout the 20th century. I mean, it opens with the concept of the Edwardian gentleman and lady firmly in place, class structure, class privilege, race privilege, sex privilege. The entire structure of the assumptions of the post-medieval world are in place and functioning. Now, 90 years later, none of this is in place. And to my mind, the major factor working to achieve this end has not been the two world wars or the exploration of the unconscious by Dada and Surrealism or the breakdown of classical design mores or any of this stuff. It's been the psychedelic experience. The psychedelic experience is a genuine paradigm-shattering phenomenon. We claim that we want this. This is what lies behind the love of flying saucers and the Loch Ness monster, and all of this is we want a paradigm-shattering object, piece of evidence, body of testimony, something like that. But what we don't realize is we have it. We have it. But as somebody over here on this side of the room said, it's a matter of courage. And this places it in a special mode. It's not something where we can just validate it and then, found an institute and appoint experts and expect them to issue a report. It's something actually at the center of our being. And my motivation for talking to audiences like this is simply that I cannot conceive of mature human beings going from the cradle to the grave without ever finding out about this. I mean, it's not like not finding out about sex or something. It's just too weird. It's a part of our birthright. It's not a cultural artifact. It's not like being able to ride a bicycle or something like that, where you can imagine that pygmies or Amazonian Indians go from birth to the grave and they never ride a bicycle and they never miss it. But this is a little more existentially front and center than that. I mean, this is, as far as I can tell, the dimension in which we most fully experience ourselves as ourselves. Well, you know, culture, we have to be very careful about the corrosive effects of culture. Some of you may know about these, it was reported in Time magazine a month or two ago, about these forms of salamanders that never, if the conditions of alkalinity in the lakes are at a certain level, they never mature into the adult form. They actually can reproduce in a juvenile form. So there can be generations of these salamanders that don't even suspect the existence of an adult form that lies beyond the sexually mature functional adult form. And this is how I sort of think of what the effect of human culture has been on us. Starting about 15 or 20,000 years ago, for reasons that we'll discuss tomorrow, ego began to emerge as a factor in human societies. For the moment, let's just say it had to do with the concern for tracing male lines of paternity. In other words, once men had it enough together to understand the role that sexuality was playing in childbearing, then there became this concern to trace male lines of descent. And suddenly, sexuality had to be very carefully controlled, and the concept, my children, my women, my food, my territory, came into being. Before that, there was a kind of orgiastic, polymorphic sexuality that did not promote this kind of boundary formation at the edge of the body's effectiveness. You know, in other words, the ego was not a concept as rooted as it is in us. And I think that the shift from this boundaryless, group-oriented consciousness, which was psychedelic, to the egocentric, materialistic consciousness that typifies Western society clear back to Sumer, that this is the neurotic wrong turning, and that when we look back into the causes of it, we can see and argue fairly persuasively that it has to do with an abandonment of this relationship of ecstasy induced by plants. That there was almost a kind of symbiotic relationship between early human beings and plants, specifically psychedelic plants, and that this relationship is not something airy-fairy or unclear or operationally undefined for its participants. You get yourself lined up with and arranged correctly in relation to this thing by taking psychoactive plants. And that this is how human societies were regulated over, let's say, 1 million years. And there was nothing magical or untoward about it. It was simply that these evolving primates had a population regulatory mechanism that integrated them into the larger body of nature. And this is what has been lost in the historical process, so that human culture has become charitably a random walk, uncharitably a kind of cancerous, exponential cascade of unstoppable effects. Now, the thing is that we are in a position to understand this now, if not actually do something about it. H.G. Wells said, history is a race between education and catastrophe. Well, never more so than today, because the world is set on a course of catastrophe. The emotional constipation and rigidity of the past 1,000 years that has set us up as territorial apes with thermonuclear arsenals, all of that is just set to, go critical. Nevertheless, we are minded creatures in the presence of an evolving and rapidly shifting landscape of problems. And I think that it's a very hopeful sign to look around and notice that the only barrier to the solution of our problems are intellectual barriers, barriers in our own mind. We have the money, the technology, the mass communications, the scientific expertise, the remote sensing telemetry. What we don't have is the will to self-direct all of this technical apparatus toward a rational solution of our problems. But that means that the solution to our problems lies almost entirely in the human domain. And the human domain is the area where we observe the highest rate of unpredictable perturbation. So I don't see the situation as terminal or desperate at all. The mushroom's take on the chaos at the end of history is, this is what it's like when a species prepares to depart for the stars. It is chaotic, but it is not disordered. It is more like a birth than anything else. I mean, there is rending of tissue, there is a sense of crisis, of unstoppable forward motion, but it turns out all according to plan, all to good end. The trick is to somehow attain this vision of the ordered correctness of what is happening when it seems so chaotic, and then to template it, to strengthen it, each for ourselves, and then to replicate it and communicate it as a meme, because there is no percentage in paralysis here at the brink. The only possibility is of some kind of forward escape. You know, a forward escape is when you attain the goal by simply rushing through the gauntlet. And I think that this history that is a race between education and catastrophe is going to turn out to be a forward escape. There will be a moment of complete abandonment to the irrational. And we will look tomorrow at the time wave. We will look at Saddam Hussein and his role in all of this. But he is not the final act. This is somewhere late in Act 1, all this malarkey that we're having to put up with. But upneyent, which in this case means downstream in time, we will sprout all our worth and woof our wings. But we have a lot of shit to fly through before we get there. I guess I should say just a little bit about how I got into this. And I think curiosity is probably the ultimate value in my cosmology. It's what's gotten me anywhere I've ever been. It's the only impulse that I trust completely. And it's alive in most people as children, but it gets somehow squelched or misdirected or something. And so when I look back through my own life, I see this psychedelic impulse before there was ever a word or a name for what it was, went on to found modern science, which was to be the very temple of rationalism and reason, but it was based on the revelation of an angelic being who spoke to him from another dimension.